In 216 BC, the Roman Republic was, by every rational measure, already dead. It simply hadn't received the message yet. On the sun-scorched plains near Cannae, Hannibal Barca had just done something no enemy had ever achieved before. In a single afternoon, through perfect timing and flawless positioning, he surrounded the largest army Rome had ever assembled and annihilated it. Somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Roman soldiers were cut down, crushed, or trampled into the dust before nightfall. This wasn't a defeat. It was an extinction-level event, according to the historian Livy. The aftermath was so grotesque that the Carthaginians gathered a bushel of gold rings from the fingers of the dead. These were not ordinary soldiers. In Roman society, a gold ring was a mark of rank. Each ring represented a senator, a magistrate, and equestrian men who formed the administrative, political, and financial spine of the Republic. In the span of a few hours, Rome didn't just lose an army, it lost its managers, its investors, its decision-makers. By all conventional military logic, the war should have ended there. Rome had no field army left to speak of. Its senior generals were dead or discredited. And most dangerously of all, the Republic was broke. The treasury was nearly empty. The tax base was bleeding to death on the battlefield. And Hannibal was now roaming freely across Italy, burning farms and shattering Rome's remaining economic heartland. History textbooks often stop here to admire Hannibal's genius. The elephants, the Alps, the ambushes at the Trebia and Lake Trasimene. But battles alone do not decide long wars. There was another conflict unfolding beneath the noise of marching legions and clashing stela. Silent war fought in ledgers, treasuries, and mints. An economic war that would ultimately decide the fate of the Mediterranean world. Hannibal was a tactical genius without equal, but he was fighting against something he did not fully understand: a financial system. This is the story of how Rome, standing on the edge of total annihilation, chose an option that looked like suicide. How it deliberately shattered its own currency, seized private wealth, and mortgaged its future to buy survival in the present. And how that decision, rational, brutal, and deeply unfair, ended up saving the Republic and destroying its greatest enemy. To understand why Hannibal ultimately lost a war he kept winning on the battlefield, we have to stop thinking like generals and start thinking like accountants. Rome and Carthage were not just rival states. They were rival economic systems. Carthage, located in what is now modern Tunisia, was the ancient world's version of a global trading corporation. It was a maritime empire built on speed, volume, and liquidity. Its ships moved constantly across the Mediterranean, carrying metals, grain, textiles, and coin. The city controlled rich silver mines in Iberia and had access to gold from across North Africa. By ancient standards, Carthage was astonishingly wealthy. But wealth shaped behavior. Carthage did not rely on its own citizens to fight its wars. It didn't have to. Instead, it outsourced violence. Numidian cavalry, Balearic slingers, Iberian infantry, professional soldiers drawn from across the known world. Men who had been trained to fight since childhood. Men who knew how to kill efficiently. From a military standpoint, this was a brilliant system. Carthage could assemble a veteran army almost instantly without draining its own population. No farmers pulled from their fields. No artisans stripped from their workshops. But financially, this model contained a fatal weakness. Mercenaries do not fight for survival, they fight for payment. Every soldier in Hannibal's army represented a daily expense. Wages, food, equipment, bribes to keep tribal leaders loyal. The moment the silver stopped flowing, the army would stop moving. Worse, unpaid mercenaries had a long and ugly history of turning their weapons on their employers. Hannibal's force was a masterpiece of coordination, but it was also a machine with an enormous burn rate. Every day Hannibal remained in Italy. He was spending money he did not have. Rome, by contrast, looked poor. In 218 BC, Rome was an agrarian republic. It had land, not liquidity, fields, not vaults. It lacked sophisticated banking institutions and vast reserves of precious metals. But what it did have was a large body of landowning citizens bound by law and custom to military service. A Roman soldier was not a contractor. He was a stakeholder. He fought for his farm, his family, and the promise that the state would still exist when the war ended. This gave Rome a crucial financial advantage: flexibility. Roman soldiers could be paid late. They could be paid in promises. They could be paid in land that hadn't even been conquered yet. Carthage was fighting a war of cash flow. Rome was fighting a war of solvency. As long as Rome remained standing, no matter how badly wounded, could keep borrowing from its own future. But after Cannae, even that resilience was pushed to its limit. The Republic was no longer just losing battles. It was approaching financial collapse. The aftermath of Cannae did not feel like a military setback inside Rome. It felt like the end of the world. The panic that swept through the city was not only emotional, it was mathematical. When the surviving messengers arrived, the Senate quickly realized the scale of the disaster. In less than 3 years, Rome had lost roughly 20% of its adult male population. Entire generations of landowners, taxpayers, and soldiers were gone. To put that into modern terms, it would be as if the United States had lost 60 million working-age men in under 30 months. The economic consequences were immediate and brutal. The state treasury, the aerarium, housed in the Temple of Saturn, was effectively empty. Tax revenues collapsed as farms lay abandoned or burned by Hannibal's cavalry. Trade routes were unsafe. Markets stalled. The very people who were supposed to fund the war were lying unburied on foreign fields, and yet Rome needed another army. Not in 5 years. Not after a period of recovery. Immediately, the city itself was now vulnerable. Hannibal was in Italy, undefeated, with no Roman force capable of stopping him if he marched on Rome as Aliso, even the city itself. The Republic faced what modern economists would recognize as a sovereign debt crisis. Obligations were exploding while revenue had fallen to zero. In most ancient states, this is the point where negotiations begin. A delegation is sent. Terms are discussed. An indemnity is agreed upon. The war ends, not with victory, but with survival. Rome chose a different path. The Senate did not merely reject the idea of surrender, they banned it. The word peace was forbidden in public discussion. Mourning rituals were restricted to 30 days, not out of cruelty, but because prolonged grief would freeze commerce and paralyze what little economic activity remained. Rome was preparing to do something that looked irrational, even insane. Instead of protecting its economy, the Republic decided to sacrifice it. Faced with extinction, the Roman Senate abandoned every comforting illusion it had about normal economic behavior. They understood something brutal and fundamental. An economy can be rebuilt. A conquered state cannot. To manage the crisis, Rome appointed a special triumvirate of officials treasury mensuri. In modern terms, this was an emergency financial authority, a wartime central bank with extraordinary powers. Their mandate was simple and terrifying: find money where none existed. Their first move crossed a line that few societies are willing to cross. The state seized private trust funds, the savings of widows, the inheritances of orphans, money that had been legally protected and morally untouchable. These assets were absorbed directly into the public treasury, accompanied by formal promises of future repayment. On paper, it was a loan. In reality, it was forced nationalization of private savings. The Republic was cannibalizing its own citizens to survive. This decision reveals how close Rome truly was to collapse. You only confiscate the wealth of the defenseless when all other options are gone. But even this was not enough. Asset seizures can buy time, not victory. Eventually, the vaults empty again. There are only so many private fortunes to confiscate, and Rome was running out of both silver and people. If the Republic was going to keep fighting, It needed to change the nature of money itself. If silver could not be found, then silver would have to be stretched. Before the war, Roman money was designed to send a message. The Republic used a heavy silver coin known as the quadrigatus, weighing roughly 6.8 grams. It featured the two-faced god Janus on one side, a symbol of stability, continuity, and trust. The coin was not just currency, it was propaganda in metal form. Heavy coins told the world that Rome was solid, reliable, and solvent. After Cannae, Rome could no longer afford symbolism. As Hannibal ravaged Italy, the silver supply collapsed. Mines were lost, trade disrupted, and existing reserves had already been poured into raising and equipping emergency legions. The Republic faced a simple but terrifying arithmetic problem. The war required more money than physically existed. So Rome changed the math. Archaeological evidence shows a rapid and deliberate decline in both the weight and purity of Roman silver coinage during this period. The quadrigatus grew thinner, lighter. Its silver was increasingly diluted with copper and other base metals. Each coin contained less real value, but it still circulated at full face value. This was not counterfeiting. It was state policy. In modern terms, Rome had turned on the money printer. Then, at the darkest point of the crisis around 211 to 201 BC, the Republic made an even more radical move. It abandoned its old currency system entirely and introduced a new silver coin, the denarius. The denarius weighed only about 4.5 grams. By switching from a heavier coin to a lighter one, Rome effectively created money out of nothing. The same amount of silver could now be minted into far more coins. If 100 kilograms of silver could previously pay 10,000 soldiers, it could now pay 15,000. This was ancient quantitative easing. The consequences were immediate and predictable. Prices surged. Grain became expensive. The purchasing power of ordinary citizens collapsed. Inflation spread through markets and households alike. But for the Roman state, this was not a failure. It was a feature. Inflation allowed Rome to pay its debts with cheaper money. It transferred the cost of the war away from the empty treasury and onto everyone who held Roman currency. Every coin in circulation became a tiny, invisible taxa, forced contribution to national survival. Rome did not ask its people whether they agreed. It simply debased their savings and kept fighting. While Rome was learning how to survive by destroying the value of its own money, Hannibal faced a very different kind of crisis. He had no mint. Hannibal's army was terrifying, disciplined, and undefeated in the field. But it was also stranded deep inside enemy territory with no independent financial infrastructure. He could not debase a currency he did not control. He could not print silver he did not possess. To pay his men, Hannibal relied on plunder. At first, this worked. Southern Italy was rich, and early victories brought an influx of loot coin. Livestock valuables seized from defeated Roman allies. But plunder is not a sustainable revenue stream. It depends on constant conquest, and over time, there is simply less left to take. Hannibal captured major cities, including Tarentum, but even there, his success was incomplete. The Romans held the citadel, effectively denying him access to the city's treasury. He controlled the streets, but not the vaults. In financial terms, Hannibal was running a company whose revenues were collapsing while costs remained fixed. His army still needed to be fed, still needed to be paid, still needed to be kept loyal. Without a steady inflow of high-quality silver, cohesion began to fray. Hannibal attempted to solve the problem by issuing his own coinage in Italy, often overstriking Roman coins with Carthaginian symbols or even his own likeness. But the volumes were small, the quality inconsistent. It could not compete with the industrial scale of the Roman mint. Rome was printing its way to survival. Hannibal was slowly bleeding out. Debasing the currency bought Rome time. It did not buy ships. To defeat Carthage, Rome had to control the sea. Hannibal could be contained on land, but as long as Carthage dominated maritime supply routes, the war could not be decisively won. And navies are among the most capital-intensive tools of war ever invented. Ships require timber, tar, bronze fittings, sailcloth, and skilled labor. They require thousands of rowers who must be fed every day, whether the fleet sails or not. Rome's inflationary money had stretched silver thin, but it could not conjure an entire navy out of nothing. The treasury was still empty. Taxes could not be raised any higher. The poor were already starving, and the census of 209 BC revealed a demographic catastrophe. In some regions, the citizen population had fallen by nearly half. Rome had reached the absolute limit of extraction. There was nothing left to squeeze. In 210 BC, the consul Lavanus summoned the Senate and proposed something unprecedented. His argument was simple and devastating. We cannot demand sacrifices from the people while protecting our own wealth. The political elite would have to lead by example. Senators returned to their homes and gathered their private gold, silver plate, jewelry, and family treasures. These were not symbolic offerings. They were real, liquid assets, concentrated wealth stripped from private hands and poured directly into the public treasury. But this was not merely a donation. Every contribution was carefully recorded. Names were inscribed. Weights were measured. Accounts were kept. What emerged was not charity, but structure, a formal obligation between citizen and state. This was the birth of the tributoma proto-war bond system. Rome's wealthiest citizens were now creditors of the Republic. They had loaned their capital to fund the fleet, with the understanding that repayment would come not from taxes, but from victory itself, from captured territory, plunder, and future indemnities. The transformation was profound. If Rome lost, the elite would lose everything: property, status, and fortune. If Rome won, they would be repaid and enriched. For the first time, Rome's ruling class had total skin in the game. The war was no longer an abstract matter of honor or prestige. It was an all-in financial bet on the survival of the state. Carthage never made this leap. While Rome was turning its political elite into financial hostages of victory, Carthage was moving in the opposite direction. Hannibal's successes had not unified the Carthaginian state. They had divided it. Inside Carthage, the ruling oligarchy was tired. The war had dragged on for years, consuming money without delivering a final result. From their perspective, Hannibal was no longer a hero. He was a line item, a costly overseas operation with uncertain returns. When Hannibal sent his brother Mago back to Carthage, it was meant to be the decisive moment. Mago addressed the Senate and poured hundreds of gold rings onto the floor rings stripped from the fingers of fallen Roman nobles. Physical proof that Rome was bleeding to death. He asked for reinforcements. He asked for money. He asked for the resources to finish the war. The response revealed everything. A powerful faction within the Carthaginian Senate, led by Hanno the Great, questioned the request. If Hannibal was winning so decisively, they argued, why did he need more funding? Why continue pouring money into a war that should already be paying for itself? This was not cowardice. It was rational behavior within a broken incentive system. Carthage's elite had no personal exposure to defeat. Their wealth was diversified, protected, and largely insulated from the battlefield. Losing Hannibal's army would be tragic, but not catastrophic for them. Rome's senators were betting their entire fortunes on victory. Carthage's senators were protecting theirs. That difference was fatal. By the time a young Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio rose to prominence, the nature of the war had become clear to those willing to see it. Hannibal could not be beaten in Italy. Every Roman commander who tried learned the same lesson. He moved faster, positioned better, and punished mistakes without mercy. Meeting Hannibal head-on was not bravery. It was waste. Scipio understood something different. Hannibal's strength did not come from Italy. It came from Spain. Hispania was the financial heart of the Carthaginian war effort. Its silver mines paid the mercenaries. Its mints produced the coinage that kept armies loyal. As long as Spain remained under Carthaginian control, Hannibal's war machine, however strained, could still function. So Scipio did something radical. Instead of chasing Hannibal across Italy, he took the war to Carthage's balance sheet. In a bold and risky campaign, Scipio invaded Iberia and struck directly at New Carthage, Cartagena, the logistical and financial hub of Carthaginian power in the west. This was not just a military target, it was a vault. When New Carthage fell, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Scipio seized stockpiles of silver, captured the mints, and cut Rome's enemy off from its primary source of liquidity. This was not a battlefield victory. It was a financial decapitation. For the first time in the war, the crisis reversed. Rome, now flush with Spanish silver, stabilized its currency. The debasement slowed, then stopped. The denarius regained purity and trust. Soldiers were once again paid in high-quality coin. Carthage, by contrast, began to default. Without access to its mines, it struggled to meet payroll. Mercenaries went unpaid. Coinage from this late period becomes scarce and visibly debased in the archaeological recorda, silent testament to a state running out of money. By the time the war reached its final act, the outcome had already been decided in the mints, not on the battlefield. In 202 BC, on the plains near Zama in North Africa, Hannibal and Scipio Africanus finally faced each other. But this was no longer the same war. Hannibal's army, once the most feared force in the Mediterranean, was a shadow of its former self. Many of his veteran troops were gone, worn down by years of fighting without reliable pay. They had been replaced by raw recruits and mercenaries whose loyalty was uncertain and whose morale had been eroded by months of delayed wages. Scipio's army was the opposite. It was well-fed, well-equipped, and consistently paid in high-quality silver. Behind it stood a Roman economy that, while scarred and distorted by inflation, was once again liquid, organized, and expanding. The financial gamble had worked. At Zama, Hannibal was finally defeated. But the truth is harsher. The economic defeat had occurred years earlier. The peace treaty that followed was not an act of reconciliation. It was a receipt. Rome demanded an indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver. One talent weighed roughly 26 kilograms. In total, Carthage was ordered to deliver nearly 300 metric tons of silver over 50 years. This was not punishment. It was extraction. Those payments drained Carthage of its working capital for 2 generations. Its economy survived, but it could no longer project power. The silver flowed not into rebuilding, but into Rome's vaults where it served a very specific purpose. Repayment? Remember the loans, the confiscated savings, okay? The war bonds bought by senators who had emptied their homes to fund the fleet. This is how they were paid back. The Carthaginian indemnity became the return on investment for Rome's elite. Those who had bet everything on the survival of the Republic emerged unimaginably wealthy. Rome's ruling class did not merely save the state. They monetized its victory. The influx of silver permanently transformed the Roman economy. Bronze and barter gave way to a fully monetized silver system. The denarius became the dominant currency of the Mediterranean, shaping trade and taxation for the next 5 centuries. Rome did not just win a war, it executed a hostile takeover of the ancient world's financial system. Rome's victory in the Second Punic War is often remembered as a triumph of discipline, endurance, and military organization. But those explanations are incomplete. The decisive weapon was not the legion. It was the balance sheet. For more than a decade, Hannibal humiliated Rome on the battlefield. He destroyed armies, shattered alliances, and occupied vast swaths of Italy. By any tactical measure, he was the superior commander. Yet none of it mattered in the end, because Rome possessed something Hannibal did not: an elastic economy. Rome could stretch. It could borrow against the future. It could debase its currency, seize private wealth, and survive inflation without collapsing into chaos. It absorbed losses that would have destroyed a more rigid system and kept fighting long after logic said it should stop. Carthage, by contrast, was brittle. It was rich, but its wealth was poorly aligned with political survival. Its economy depended on constant positive cash flow and voluntary spending by an elite that had little personal stake in the outcome. When the war turned unprofitable, support evaporated. Hannibal did not run out of men. He ran out of money. The Roman victory was not an accident of fate or genius. 'Twas the result of a cold, calculated willingness to sacrifice economic stability in the short term to preserve political power in the long term. Rome understood that in a war of attrition, finance is the ultimate force multiplier. You can lose battles, you can lose generals. You can even lose entire armies. But as long as you can mobilize capital, you can always buy another one. This insight would echo through history. From the Napoleonic Wars to the World Wars of the 20th century, the same pattern would repeat. Victory belongs not to the side with the bravest soldiers, but to the one with the deepest financial system and the highest tolerance for debt. As we look at the ruins of Carthage today, we are reminded of a final, uncomfortable truth. Wealth is not power. The ability to convert wealth into sustained force is. Carthage had riches. Rome had mechanisms. And in the end, that made all the difference.